This is super exciting. After a couple years of having no new content, we are back because Dobbie is teaching some new stuff this year. So we're going to be doing a unit on the emergence of the Americas in global affairs, and we are starting today with U.S. expansionist foreign policies. So, first of all, in the 19th century, the United States is going to begin looking beyond the borders that the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans occupy. But early in that 19th century, most US administrations generally were opposed to overseas intervention because they wanted to avoid conflict with more powerful European states. And they opposed European powers intervening in the United States. We see that, for example, in 1823's Monroe Doctrine. A little bit more on that later. The United States saw itself as a republic that had broken from a European empire. So, like, why create an overseas empire ourselves? And George Washington set a precedent in his original farewell address when his presidency came to an end to avoid foreign entanglements. Those ideas supported much of American isolationism, at least as it was seen overseas. But really, were we even isolationist? The United States had expanded tremendously in the 19th century, purchasing land from France and Louisiana. We acquired Oregon in a treaty with Great Britain. The Gadsden Purchase from Mexico, giving us a little additional sliver of land in the Southwest. We purchased Alaska from Russia. There was conquest of vast Mexican territories in the Mexican-American War. And of course, Native American territories were conquered and Native Americans were relocated to various reservations in the late 19th century. By 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote his famous Turner thesis, where he argued that the American frontier was now closed, which for many said it is now time to look beyond. The late 19th century also brought tremendous economic growth to the United States as we moved into and through the Industrial Revolution. By 1900, the United States equaled UK coal production. We were exporting agricultural goods. We had more manufactured goods than the UK by 1900. And this is as the United States government generally favored what we call a laissez-faire economic policy. Hands off, leave it alone, have businesses be generally free from government intervention. But despite this, the US government had levied high tariffs on foreign goods. Remember, tariffs are taxes on imported goods because American growth and American businesses was sufficient with the population we had in the United States. It wasn't seen as necessary to have more free trade agreements because American companies were doing great selling to Americans. Business interests had also stopped reciprocity agreements. These are trade agreements that would bring down barriers of trade between nations and had originally opposed annexation of Hawaii. Now, we mentioned already the Monroe Doctrine. This dates from the early 19th century in the presidency of James Monroe with regard to Latin American countries that were now gaining their independence from Spain. The United States warned other European nations to not interfere with the Americas, that this was our domain. The United States, however, did intervene when it saw its interests threatened. For example, in Mexico, France had tried to start a puppet state in Mexico with the creation of a French emperor ruling in Mexico. This was opposed and ultimately stopped by the United States. The United States in Alaska had acquired that territory from Russia, a purchase in 1867, where the United States bought from Russia Alaska for about $7 million, a relatively small amount. Even at that small amount, it was originally known as Seward's Folly. Our Secretary of State was William Seward, but it would prove to be incredibly valuable for the resources and strategic location of that territory. For example, that $7.2 million in today's dollars is approaching only $160 million, a bargain compared to the resources that came from it. The United States was also looking in the Far East. China and Japan were each seen as opportunities by Europeans and Americans for trade. And the United States executed trade agreements with both nations that offered the United States more favorable agreements. Migrants from both of those countries came to the United States for jobs that were opening up, especially in the American railroad industry. But that would be reversed for the Chinese, at least, with 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act, where many politicians had felt that the number of Chinese people moving to the United States had grown too large, and they put this restriction that virtually ended the ability of Chinese people to move to the United States. Now, this is also the era of new imperialism in Europe, where European states were looking to territories in Africa and in Asia. This is highlighted by the scramble for Africa, where virtually all of the African continent would be imperialized by European states for resources for their industrialization. Japan is also becoming an imperial power at this time, as they are going to go to war with China in what is now the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895. So many imperial powers around the world. The United States will be looking to expand in the Pacific, largely for the need for coaling stations. Remember, this is the era of steamships taking over sail-driven ships, wind-driven ships, and those steamships need to refuel. So locations like Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean are going to be strategic military and economic holdings so ships can refuel as they're making their way across the Pacific. Now, Hawaii itself was originally seen as a protectorate state, but soon after calls for annexation, or the absorbing into your nation, the owning of a territory by a nation would come, and Hawaii would ultimately be annexed by the United States in 1898. Other islands in the Pacific, like Midway Island, Guam, and Samoa, would also be acquired during this time to give additional naval bases and refueling stations. This is all deeply connected with American military interest and the desire to expand as a world military power. This is heavily influenced by a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote an influential book called The Influence of Sea Power, where he looked at other European powers and how their navies would propel them to dominance. This encouraged the United States expansion of our Navy with a modern steam fleet and the acquisition of those coaling stations around the Pacific. Also, the call for creating a canal across Latin America, and we'll talk about the Panama Canal soon enough. So we'll get back to it in a couple days, but there's a good start as the United States becoming this expansionist power. See you again.